Record. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the panel discussion of local election integrity. Are we secure enough? I'm Cheryl Roller, the VP of Advocacy and Education for the League of Women Voters of Metro Columbus. Tonight's webinar is a collaboration between the League of Women Voters of Metro Columbus, the League of Delaware County, and the League of Licking County, along with support from the League of Women Voters of Ohio. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that neither supports nor opposes political candidates or parties. The League of Women Voters values civil discourse as a means to understand other viewpoints, clarify personal positions, and allow individuals to advocate for issues they care about. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator tonight, Amy Juravich. Amy Juravich is the host and executive producer of All Sides with Amy Juravich on 89.7 NPR News. All Sides is WOSU Public Media's daily news program that dives deep into issues important to Central Ohio. And one issue very important to Central Ohio is local election integrity. We welcome Amy. We're so glad to have you as our moderator tonight. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, and thank you to the League of Women Voters of Licking County, Delaware County, and of Columbus as well. And I appreciate everyone who's attending this webinar tonight, and I hope that we can be informative and hopefully you'll learn something. I want to start off by introducing our panelists. We have Antone White, Director of the Franklin County Board of Elections. Antone, if you want to say hi.
Hello, everyone.
We also have Brian Mead, Deputy Director of the Licking County Board of Elections. Brian, if you want to say hi.
Hello.
And then we have Brian Hester, our second Brian, Deputy Director of the Delaware County Board of Elections. Brian, say hi to everyone.
Good evening, everybody.
Our goal this evening is to have a discussion of the measures that each of these election officials undertake to ensure that our elections are well managed and that voting is fair and fraud-free, and that all legitimate votes are counted. So I want to start off with Antone. Can you tell me about the relationship between county election officials and the Secretary of State's office? So the Secretary of State runs elections for the state, but in Ohio, each county runs its own elections. So who's in charge of what?
Good question. And thank you, Amy. And thank you to the League of Women Voters for having us tonight. So the relationship between the Secretary's office and county boards of elections, it's really a bottom-up sort of organization in that the Secretary sets statewide policy and issues directives that each 88 county boards of elections follow. But we at the local level, we have to administer those directives. And so we do that but county by county with our own set of resources that we get through our local county commissioners. And so we have to run and implement those directives, Ohio Revised Code, here locally.
And Brian Hester, you're with Delaware County, a county that's smaller and more rural than Franklin County, but also known as the fastest growing county in the state. What challenges has your office faced in recent years with all of the growth in Delaware County? Because I'm guessing growth means more voters.
That's right. So we are required, all boards of elections are required to keep voting precincts to a certain number of voters. So obviously, one of the biggest changes we've had with growth is we have to keep adding new precincts so that we keep the number of voters the same. We also are obviously looking for polling locations so that we can keep voting accessible to voters. And, you know, that is just as difficult sometimes as finding people to work the polls. I think people overlook how difficult it is or the challenge it is because you're basically coming onto somebody else's property twice a year. You know, we're storing equipment there, setting up all day. And, you know, it's quite a commitment from these churches and schools to allow us to do that for every election.
And Brian Mead with Licking County, more rural than Franklin County, but also a growing county as well. Are there any issues you faced in recent years, either with being a little more rural or with the growth that you've had that's been pressing upon your election department?
Well, I guess sort of agreeing with Brian is, since we're growing, we need to make sure we keep those partnerships with our polling locations. We're also trying to keep up with technology so that we can put multi precincts in one location. So most of our locations have at least two precincts, and then a few have four or five. So we're trying to keep up with technology to help us do things quicker, faster, and better.
And Brian Mead, sticking with you, how long have you been an election official? Is that a job you always thought you'd have? I mean, did you go to school to get a degree in elections?
Oh no, no. I was a farm kid, so I went to Ohio State, got a degree in agriculture. And my part-time job was working in the legislature. I got I guess, the political bug and the government kick. Um, I spent a few years in a large county, Montgomery County, 4 years at their elections. And then more recently, I came back to state government in Central. I worked for the Delaware State before the last 9 years being in Licking County as the director or deputy director.
Is Brian Mead breaking up for everyone, or is it just for me? I'm trying to determine, like, is he frozen? Okay. I think that the best thing for Brian Mead to do might be to turn off his video. I do a lot of Zoom calls on my show, and sometimes if we turn off the video, then you can save bandwidth and your audio will work better. So we'll get back to Brian Mead going from getting into his election job. Antone, let me ask you the same question. How long have you been working in elections? How did you find yourself in this job doing this?
So I've been with the Franklin County Board of Elections since 2019. Started out as the executive manager, and then about a year and a half later, I was appointed director. I did not think I would be in elections, but it's been the greatest job that I've ever had. I will say that. I've worked in local government for nearly 20 years now, both at the city and county level. And this has just been a great experience, working with good people people who care about democracy and ensuring that people have an opportunity to vote. That's just the most fulfilling thing for me. And so it's a pleasure to serve in my role.
Brian Hester, what about you? Did you go to college to be an election official?
No. And I'll tell you, if you go to the Ohio Association of Elected Officials and ask every member of this, I think you would be hard pressed to find. I've yet to meet somebody that said, yes, I went to school, and we all kind of just wound up into it. And just like Antoine said, it's not what I set out to do. I graduated law school from the University of Cincinnati, practiced private law, always was interested in politics, really kind of got involved in party politics, and kind of just landed here. But it just like Antoine said, absolute dream job. And it allowed me to move up here about a year ago when I became the deputy director here in Delaware County. And it's been a great experience.
And Brian Hester, sticking with you, there's been a lot of talk about election security, especially recently. Worries about fraud have been talking points for years. Have you had any serious security issues in Delaware County? Have you had anything that's given you pause?
Nothing to give me pause, but that's because we're always trying to stay ahead of the game when it comes to technology with cybersecurity. We're always, very mindful of physical security of the machines. So we haven't had that, but I think that's not because we've been lucky, but because I think across Ohio, we've taken it very seriously.
Antone, what about Franklin County? What's the biggest security issue you have faced in your time of being in charge of the elections department?
I don't know that we've experienced any large scale security issues. We've had incidents. I think every county board of election has had an incident. But a lot of times that doesn't equal fraud. Mistakes don't necessarily equal fraud. I can tell you we had an issue last year, an unfortunate incident in our May excuse me, our November 2025 election, we had a candidate missing from our ballot, and that was due to an issue between us and another county. Now, we quickly resolved that issue, but those are some of the things that can happen from time to time. What I've learned in this role is that preparation, is key. And so when you're prepared and you have plans in place and you have backup plans in place, you know how to resolve things very quickly. And so that's what we were able to do last year. And we continue to prepare so that, when incidents do happen, we know how to respond.
Yeah, Antone, that idea that mistakes don't equal fraud. I like that phrase, but also is it usually human error or is it sometimes technology error or like, yeah, where
It can
does
be,
the mistake
yeah,
happen?
it can be both, but humans control technology,
Mhm.
right? Even if it's a technology error.
Well, maybe we do.
Right, maybe, maybe not, but a
Mm,
lot of times it's human error. We work in the election business is a business where people demand perfection, but we're not always perfect.
mm,
And when we're not perfect, the mistake happens in public when it comes to elections. And
mhm.
so, again, it's important to be transparent. It's important to communicate what happened and how things were corrected. And so, we have to remember again that a mistake doesn't equal fraud because a lot of times people will see something happen and say that's fraud. It's not fraud, it's a mistake, but how you communicate that and when you're transparent, you can sort of mitigate how that's played out in public.
And Brian Mead from Licking County, can you tell us about any security concerns or security issues you faced in your county during your time there?
I mean, our biggest concern is just the lack of voter trust in the system.
Mm,
The there's always these rumors out there, and trying to convince the public, number one, that your vote counts and it's safe, it has just been more and more of a challenge that we all have to face. You guys know this. We're really fortunate in Ohio. We do things right. It's really hard to cheat. Rarely ever happens, and it's pretty easy to vote here in Ohio. But the public support or the trust in government has been a real challenge for us.
mm. Yeah, Brian Hester, you were nodding there. Do you worry about that voters don't trust the system?
I think that's become a bigger part of our job in recent years. Is we're always balancing making voting convenient for voters against making sure that bad actors can influence the result or result in that. And with the social media age being what it is, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. And so we have come under the microscope, but I think, in a way that was good for us because maybe people kind of took what we did for granted. And, it's allowed us to kind of be introspective and make sure that we are doing everything we can um, to make sure that things are secure. And so that's why events like this are very important. It gives us an opportunity to show that we are publicly transparent and accountable.
Antone, what do you say to people who are having trust issues? Because just by saying, it's okay, I promise, you can trust me, that's probably not enough for some people.
No, it's not. I always tell people, you know, do your homework and go to your sources. Misinformation. I think Brian Hester mentioned this. We had an incident here. One of my employees here told me. She said that one of her in church, one of her members of church at the Sunday service stood up and made an announcement and said, for this upcoming election, you need to bring your birth certificate in order to vote. You have to show your birth certificate. And so my employee, had to stand up and say, wait a minute, I work for the Board of Elections. That's not true. Where did you hear that? Well, I heard that on Facebook. And so that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with misinformation. We're dealing with this big social media age where everyone gets their information, news from social media. And what I always try to tell people is go to your trusted sources, your local county board of election, the Ohio Secretary of State, people like and organizations like the League of Women Voters. Those are organizations and groups that are going to give you the right information. And so when you have the right information, then you'll be able to do the right things when it comes to voting.
Yeah, Brian Mead, a few minutes ago, you mentioned that Ohio is an easy place to vote and Ohio does things well. The Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, is known for saying that we have some of the most secure elections in the county. We do, and we also have some of the strictest voter ID requirements around the country as well. Do you feel like those voter ID requirements make it safe, or are they too strict? They work? What do you think, Brian Mead?
I think they work. I think having the photo ID definitely helps relay some of the folks' concerns. I mean, it's very common that the folks will say that you have to show a driver's license to buy beer. So why not have to show a driver's license, to vote? Um, I do think it's a good thing to have the photo ID.
Yeah, Brian or Antone, do either of you want to weigh in on the photo ID here in Ohio? Brian Hester?
I mean, I think for the process to work, the democratic process to work in this country, people have to have faith in it. And I don't weigh in on policy decisions. I implement policy that's passed by the legislature, by the Congress, and by the Secretary of State. So I'll leave that to others to comment on it. But I do think, anecdotally, it's allowed people to have a little more confidence that we are checking. Really, the biggest thing we're doing, though, when we're looking at an ID, is we're really more interested in confirming, where do you live? Where do you currently reside? Because what we want to do is make sure that not only is that person a lawful voter, but they're also voting in the right races that are going to affect them and their communities and their lives. So that's the other big component of the ID. And I think a lot of lay people don't understand that that's really one of the big things we're looking at is establishing that this person is not only who they are and that they're a registered voter, but they're voting the right ballot for them.
Antone, I have to think that in Franklin County, that issue comes up a lot with people moving more often. How often do people show up with an ID that has the wrong address on it?
Well, it happens, but the ID, the address on the ID doesn't matter as much as what you tell us when we ask you where you live. So as long as you tell us where you currently live, and as long as that matches what we have in our poll book, then you're okay to vote. We're looking at expiration dates. That's the biggest issue. We see sometimes expired IDs, and we're making sure that IDs aren't expired. But I think the biggest challenge, with the recent changes and going to stricter IDs, the biggest challenge for me is just how do we educate the public, right? A lot of these things get done, these legislative changes get done so quickly, we don't have time, and sometimes we don't have the budget to sort of educate voters. Again, that's why the League of Women Voters and other organizations are very important to help us sort of educate the public. Here in Franklin County, we send out every general election. We've done so for the past 4 years. We send out a voter information guide in the general election to every registered household in the county because we want them to have the right information about voting in that election. With the recent changes with Senate Bill 293, we decided to send one out in the primary because we're trying to educate voters. And so, but it comes at a cost, right? So that's the biggest challenge I see is not so much the changes, but how we let the public know about the changes so they have the right information.
I will say one time I voted in a primary and the poll worker looked at my ID and said, "Oh, be careful, your ID expires in just a couple of months," because and they warned me that I wouldn't be able to vote in the general election if I didn't go renew my ID. And so I was like, "Oh, that's a nice service. Thanks for the reminder."
Hope that was in Franklin County.
It wasn't
There you
Franklin
go.
County.
Okay.
Yes. It was a nice service. For anyone who has joined us a little late, we are talking about the elections in 2026. We're talking about election security, and we have with us Antone White, Director of the Franklin County Board of Elections, Brian Mead, Deputy Director of the Licking County Board of Elections, and Brian Hester, Deputy Director of the Delaware County Board of Elections. Antone just mentioned that bill number. I'm not a big fan of House bill numbers, but whatever number it was, it passed. So there is some legislation that was recently signed by Governor DeWine, and it eliminated the 4-day grace period for an absentee ballot to be counted. So now your absentee ballot must be in the hands of your county elections board on election day or before to be counted. Brian Hester, let's start with you. Do you have any
Sure.
worries about this change? Antone just talked about how he's communicating, but how are you going to communicate to the procrastinators out there to not procrastinate?
Well, the first thing to notice is, and I'm curious what Brian and Antoine says, we're noticing vote by mail has really fallen off the cliff in terms of popularity. People really like to vote either at their polling location on election day or early in the vote centers, 28 days before out. So our biggest challenge though is there are still people that rely on voting by mail, so it's just communicating that information, relying on surrogate organizations like Legal Women Voters to make sure voters know that you have to have that here. And by here, I mean the Board of Elections. You cannot turn it into a polling location. It's got to be here at the Board of Elections on election day. And those changes happen. This is not the first time we've had changes by vote by mail. I mean, I think people will recall, the deadline for the application used to be the Saturday before the election, and then they moved it to a week before. There are going to be some people who unfortunately don't get that information in time, and that's unfortunate. But the best we can do is to use our social media challenges, to use the media, to use organizations like Legal Women Voters to try to make sure as many people are educated about that. It's actually on the mail piece that will go out with your absentee ballot, notifying them that that has changed, and then it does need to be not just mailed by the day of the day before the election. Now it has to physically be here before polls close on election day.
Brian Mead, you were nodding when Brian Hester was saying that fewer people are voting absentee. Are you seeing that as well? Do you have a lot of absentee ballots in your county?
I definitely agree with Brian, and no, it's going down. Right now, I think I have about almost 300 apps in, and we expect to have about 3,000 total by the end of the election, but I don't know if we'll make that. Where I think I agree with Brian, early voting is probably going to be much higher, and then at the polls will definitely increase as well.
Antone, I think your answer might be a little different. I'm thinking you have more absentee voters than these other two counties.
Yeah, Franklin County, I think we're the number one, probably early vote county in the state, probably number two mail county in the state behind Cuyahoga. I'm looking at our numbers now. I think they're about what I expect. I think we have about close to 3,000 applications in. For an election of this size, we'll probably expect about 10,000 mail ballots. That's to be expected. I'm just more curious about what's going to happen with the return of the ballot, because that postmark doesn't matter anymore. And I think we're thinking internally we're going to see more traffic up here of people trying to drop off their ballots, and what that does for us up here in terms of trying to get all those ballots in and people trying to come up to vote early. And so that's something we have to manage up here. But we have a plan, and we're kind of monitoring it, and we'll see how we pivot into the general election.
Do you worry about people bringing those absentee ballots to their polling location? What happens if they do that? Antone, you want to take that?
Yeah, we tell our voting location managers, and we instruct our poll workers to remind voters who do that they have to bring it to 1700 Morse Road. We don't see a lot of that in Franklin County. I think we'll see more of it now. So we're just going to reinforce that through our poll workers, and we'll keep our fingers crossed. We'll hope that they get it up here by 7:30, because that's when it has to be here. But we'll see. We're going to monitor it. We're going to see what happens, and then we'll make a plan from there for the general, because the general will be much larger in scale, obviously.
Yeah. Brian Mead, there's been a lot of talk at the national level about absentee ballots in general. The Trump administration wants Congress to pass a bill that includes a lot of things. We'll get to some of those, but a lot of things. But when it comes to absentee ballots, the bill will limit who can use them. What are your overall thoughts on absentee ballots in general as a way to vote?
Well, I also really like ditto Brian Hester when he says I don't make the policy, but I think absentee ballots are a good thing, and they should be utilized, definitely utilized by those folks that are not going to be at the polls on election day. It's convenient, so I hope to see that we keep doing what we're doing in Ohio and have a no fault absentee where you don't really need to have an excuse like you're in college or you're out of state, but that remains to be seen.
Yeah, Antone, what about you and the no fault absentee? That could go away if the Trump administration passes a bill that's being considered right now. What are your overall thoughts on absentee ballots?
Well, my first thought is President Trump will have to vote in person. He won't be able to use his mail ballot anymore if that happens. But
Yes. Okay. So what he's
yeah,
referring to is that in the primary in Florida, President Trump did vote absentee.
yeah.
Yeah.
But on a serious note, I think we need to maintain what we have. I think our absentee system here in Ohio works well, and it's secure. And I think that's what people need to understand. From ballot, receiving your application to processing it, reviewing signature verifications, to sending out your ballot, bringing it back. It's handled by a bipartisan team. So the entire process from start to finish is secured. We've had very few, if to any, incidents with absentee voting, and so we've not had any incidents of ballot harvesting. So really, the process is secured, and I hope that it would be left the way it is because this will really impact young people, college students. It's going to impact our confined voters. So our seniors in nursing homes, we go out and we vote seniors in their nursing home. And they don't have valid photo ID because they're older, they've not kept up with their IDs. And so this is going to affect seniors, young people, and so on college campuses. So we hope that it stays in place.
Mm. That's a part of the concern, though, is when you absentee vote, you don't need to show that photo ID. So then they're talking about the photocopies of the photo IDs. Anton, what worries you about that? Do you have
What
worries about that?
I do. What worries me is that if they move to that model, then people are gonna start sending us their actual ID.
Mm.
And because we get that, sometimes that happens. Sometimes somebody will actually put their ID in their envelope and send it to us. And so I'm concerned that we're gonna see more incidents of that. It's just another step that I don't think is necessary because we check your address, we check your signature, we check your date of birth, we check the ID you provide us, we check that it matches what we have in our system. So we have multiple ways to verify that you are who you are. We do it when we send out your ballot, we do it when you return your ballot to us. And so again, the process is secure. So I'm not sure that it's necessary to go to that step. If we go to that step, we'll implement it, but the process is secure as the way it is today.
And just to be clear, that has not passed. You do not need to change the way you do that right now. That's just a proposal. Brian Hester, you were nodding there about those checks and balances to prevent fraud. As I said before, Secretary of State Frank LaRose says on many occasions Ohio is one of the most secure states in the nation. Brian Hester, tell me something that sets us apart. What sets Ohio apart? What makes us one of the most secure states?
Well, first of all, I want to point out that technically in Ohio right now, you can actually send a copy of your ID as a form of identification for an absentee ballot. But just as Antoine said, we're doing signature comparisons, both when you apply for an absentee ballot and when it's returned. So we are double checking to make sure that that is really the ID for an absentee ballot, that the signature matches, that they are providing the correct date of birth, that they're providing the same Social Security. Now, to answer your question, I think one of the things Ohio does very well, that we're probably ahead of most states on, is really taking a serious look at cybersecurity and looking at There's a lot of relationships in a board of elections. You've got the relationship between us and the Secretary of State, but there's also a lot of technology. And with that technology, there are vendors who sell this equipment that we all rely on. It's kind of a niche market. And we have done a very good job, I think, of setting standards for cybersecurity, setting standards for what kind of equipment we're going to allow to be used in Ohio, and really taking a look at the Board of Elections vendor relationship to make sure that it's a true partnership, to make sure that our equipment is reliable, safe, and secure.
Brian Mead, do all counties use the same equipment? Like, does Licking County use the same stuff as Delaware and Franklin?
I'll throw my voice and say no.
Brian, I think you're still muted. I think you hit the wrong button there. You want to give it a try?
There we go.
There we go. Yeah, what about the equipment? So do you use the same stuff as Franklin and Delaware?
I used the same as Franklin, but not the same as Delaware. So it is not correct that we all use the same equipment. It's a specialized field, like they were saying, and I think there's 4 vendors that we can choose from. And then each vendor sort of has multiple styles they can do. Like half the counties do what's known as an optical scan, where they'll take a large absentee ballot where you're filling in the oval and then put that in the scanner. I do a hybrid where you take a little ballot, a blank little ballot activation card, goes into a touch screen, and it marks your ballot, and then you put that small marked activation card into the scanner, and it counts it. Others have where the machine is all in one, where you put a ballot in, and then the machine will count it, and you don't have to go to the scanner. So there's slight variations all over the state. The good thing is they're all checked by the federal government, but also the state government. We have specific guidelines and specific boards that set those standards and stuff.
And Brian Hester, I mean, Brian Mead just said that you use a different system than what Franklin and Licking does. What's different about yours? Or
I'm trying to remember if he's talking about the poll pads or
is it just a different brand? Yeah, I don't know.
Or our Unisys. But actually, I think that's one of the things that makes us more secure, is that we don't have all 88 counties using the same equipment, which does make it more difficult for somebody to quote unquote hack the entire election. Another thing is, each county maintains its own voter registration database for that county. So that basically is almost like an 88 county blockchain to prevent the state's voter registration system from being, completely hacked and preventing anybody from voting on election day, or preventing certain people from voting on election day. So, I think it's actually a good thing that that the state will certify multiple vendors and multiple equipment and leave that decision to us as individual counties to make what works best for us. And because there are differences, that also makes the election more secure.
And Brian, going to go use the poll pad. Are you talking about the iPads, or what did you say?
Poll books. Sorry. Yeah, basically electronic poll books.
Okay.
So I know like Antoine uses a different vendor for his electronic poll books than we do. But the fundamental, the fundamentals behind the technology is the same. They still have to meet certain requirements to be certified. They're still air gapped. They're not required to, none of the machines that you cast a ballot on can have any type of network ability to connect to a network or Wi-Fi. It's not a matter of it just being turned off. It has to have it physically removed so that these machines literally cannot access the internet.
Yeah. Anton, I'm calling them the iPads. So they're actually called electronic poll books. Is that what we're supposed to call them? Okay. So does every county in Ohio use those?
I think every county but one. I think there's one county that's still on paper poll books, but I think the other 87 are on electronic poll books.
And how has that been going? They work well. Is it better than having the paper books that we all know and love from years past?
Yeah, they're much faster. It allows us to um, have one line to check people in. So with your paper poll books, you have the A through N line and the M through K line, and
Hmm.
so depending on your last name, you have to get into that line, and some lines are longer than the others. But with the electronic poll book, it streamlines that. So they've been in place for a number of years. The technology has gotten better. We could check in a voter in a minute and a half as opposed to 2, 3, 4 minutes on a paper poll book. That just helps with line management. It gets people through the process faster and keeps those lines down on election day.
The other thing
Brian?
they do, I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Brian. Yep.
The other thing they do a really good job is prevent poll worker error.
Mm.
Uh, um, in two fundamental ways. One is it handles the processing provisional voters a lot better. It also eliminates the risk of a voter getting the wrong ballot, which I talked about earlier. So I agree with everything Antoine said. We actually had to use paper poll books last May because there was a bit of a concern about the brand of poll books we used at the time. There was a security incident in another county. And at the time, it was so close to the election, the Secretary of State didn't have time to properly investigate it. So he just told us use paper poll books, which is what we're required to do as a backup anyways. We used them. They inspected it with the vendor, and lo and found it really wasn't an issue that impacted us. And so we were able to again use them in November, and we're using them in the spring. But the thing is, we always have that backup, but it really is a good system because it kind of creates guardrails where we have greatly reduced the errors by innocent errors by poll workers that nonetheless, if not prevented, would affect a voter's ballot.
Did you have to have all of the paper poll books printed, or just in case, or you knew ahead of time to get them all printed?
We always have to have a paper poll book as a backup in case, for whatever reason, let's say that they just go down, they just don't work. We're like NASA. We always have redundancies based on redundancies. So we're always required to have that there just in case. It's kind of our plan B, but in this case, it was our plan A. And so, yeah, we printed it out and processed them. We had to be a little creative to figure out, because like Brian Mead says, it gives like our poll pads normally give a authority to vote slip that then is scanned to bring up the ballot. So we had to figure out how we were going to do that process so we could use the rest of our equipment while still maintaining security. And so most voters in Delaware County probably didn't even notice a real difference because we were able to create a process that still kept it convenient to them, but we were able to still maintain security.
What about you, Brian Mead? Do you miss the paper books, or are you pretty happy with electronic ones? Oh, did Brian Mead freeze again?
Oh, shoot.
Oh, there you go. Yep, you're back.
I'm very happy with electronic poll books, and I don't want to go back to paper. It was not fun last primary.
Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit now. I wanted to pivot to voter confusion, which we've touched on a little bit, but there's a lot of talk at the national level about a bill that's called the SAVE Act. That stands for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. It is not passed. I want to emphasize that. But I think even talking about the changes to voter ID requirements is causing some voter confusion. So if passed, the SAVE Act requires proof of citizenship to register to vote. So not just a driver's license, but something more like a birth certificate or a passport. It's just a proposal and is not passed, but it's a top priority of the Trump administration. And anyone can take this question first. But do you have concerns that even if nothing happens with the SAVE Act between now and the primary or now and the general election, even if nothing happens, voters will still think they need to bring a birth certificate or a passport to the polls? Who wants to go first?
Oh,
Brian? Yeah.
I
Okay.
mentioned the story about my
Yeah.
employee at church and the birth certificates. So I think there's, again, I have a concern about misinformation, and so how do you combat that? and it's the SAVE Act and everything that's going on around it. Both sides, how they're debating this, is causing a lot of confusion amongst our voters, and so I have a big concern. But we'll see what happens. We'll see where it lands, and we'll try to deal with it best we can.
Yeah, Buster, what are your thoughts?
I mean, we react to bills when they become laws because anything can happen in the legislative process. I mean, right now you can use your passport in Ohio as a valid ID, which, by the way, didn't always used to be the case because it doesn't have your address on it. My understanding, and I might be wrong, so please, this is a great time to fact check me, is that if you have the real ID compliant, the one with the little star on it, told us we needed to fly in TSA. I believe the SAVE Act will allow that to be valid. And I will tell you that right now, whether it's a real ID compliant or not, we are checking driver's license to ensure that it doesn't indicate that the person is not a U.S. citizen. So we're already checking that in IDs. Again, whether there's this act or not, whether or not it's a real ID or just the standard state ID, we're already checking to make sure that somebody is not somehow got registered to vote even though they're not a U.S. citizen.
Brian, did you want to weigh in there?
Well, I guess I just gotta talk people off the ledge and explain to them, no, they're talking about possible registration. If you're registered now, you're fine. You don't need to bring your birth certificate. You don't need to go buy a birth certificate. Your driver's license is going to be just fine to vote. And just try to explain the difference between, ID for voting and what registration is. So most of our voters already have a driver's license and are registered. So it's just trying to calm fears.
I don't know about what Brian Hester was saying regarding if a real ID, the fancy ID, says if you're a citizen or not. Because I thought that there was another special code that was like for a citizenship on an ID. Because I think that's part of the concern is you can be in this country legally, but be an immigrant. So someone with like TPS status, temporary protected status, they can get a driver's license. But perhaps they're not supposed to vote. Antone, do you know about what the real ID and if it has a citizenship marking on it?
I'm not as familiar with that component. I know in Ohio, the driver's licenses and state IDs are now stamped with non-citizenship. If you're here legally and you have an ID, but you're not a citizen. And so we've been instructed by the Secretary of State to look for that on IDs when we're checking in voters. And so that's what we do. I'm not sure about the real ID component. So Brian Hester may have some more information on that than I do, but I know that the non-citizenship marker's on there if you're not a citizen.
Yeah.
At least in Ohio.
Yeah, that's my understanding. So if you got a driver's license because you're here on TPS and you want to get a job, you want to be able to drive legally, then your ID has a non-citizen stamp on the ID. So it's a valid driver's license, but it's a non-citizen, right? Brian Hester, were you Googling while we were talking?
Yeah, I was. So at least according to our own Channel 4, there is an exception for the real ID, but only for 5 states because on that real ID, it actually indicates citizenship. So Ohio would not fall under that loophole. So I want to correct myself there, but it probably would because I would think the natural reaction would be that the Ohio General Assembly would then mandate that it be put on the real ID to get it under that exception. So I do want to correct myself. It does say that, but it actually is only limited to 5 states that actually affirmably indicate citizenship, which it says Ohio's real ID does not.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about election security. People want to know that their voting process is secure, that it's not being manipulated. They want to know that their vote counts. So Brian Hester, this kind of relates to what you were saying about the voting machines being not connected to the internet at all. So can voting machines actually be hacked?
anything can be hacked. A paper ballot can be hacked. If you wanted to affect a paper ballot election, all you would have to do is, there's talked about having graphite under your fingernail, and you would just double mark a ballot and you create an overvote, and now you've impacted the ballot. That's not the issue. The issue is, do we take reasonable precautions to minimize the risk? So yes, we have them air gapped. The other thing is, I'm sure all these guys will cringe when I say this term, we balance. So every time you use a poll pad, you're creating a record that poll pad said, hey, I just processed a voter, and here's how many voters I processed. And then you go to the ballot marker and you make your ballot. Well, that machine's going to have a record of how many ballots it's made. And then you're going to put it into the tabulator, and the tabulator is going to say, this is how many ballots I processed. And what we literally do as part of our process, part of our security, is we're constantly balancing to make sure that all these numbers add up and are consistent, so that there's no way that somebody just dropping in 100 ballots out of nowhere. We're constantly auditing these as the process is going on. One of the first steps you do in early voting in the morning is you go around the machines, count how many ballots they show on them, and you compare that to the report you did the night before to make sure that there's nothing on there. We are constantly checking these numbers to make sure that nobody is trying to inject false data into these things. And then everything else is physical seals and strong cybersecurity principles. So that's why we have everything air gapped, so that they can't connect to networks.
Anton, what do you want to add about that? Making sure every vote is counted and there's no double counting.
Yeah, I mean, what Brian Hester said is correct in terms of reconciliation. We're reconciling the number of check-ins to the number of ballots that were tabulated at a precinct or at a location. And if they don't match, then we research why, and we reconcile that. But I think in addition to that, just when we talk about election security, I think what we've not talked about is the bipartisanship that each county boards of elections have here in the state of Ohio. There's literally a Republican and a Democrat at every step of the process managing the process. And that's really what is unique about Ohio compared to other states. You go to the state of Florida, there's an elected official who runs the county board of elections in the state of Florida, and that person can hire whoever they want to hire. That's not to say it's less secure. I'm not saying that, but what I'm saying here in Ohio is we have directors and deputy directors who are appointed by a bipartisan board. I'm a Democrat. The deputy director here is a Republican. Together, he and I, we run this board of election here in Franklin County. We do it together, and we do it in a bipartisan manner. That, to me, shows how secure our elections are in Franklin County and in Ohio, Delaware, Licking, because we work together in a bipartisan manner to administer the elections.
Brian Mead from Licking County, is there anything that would be different with the way things are done in a more rural county versus the way it's done in Franklin County? Different priorities, different needs for your Board of Education or Board of Election? What's that? Wrong board. Board of Election, yeah.
Not really. I mean, it's pretty well just different scales. So Franklin County is about 10 times bigger. He's going to have about 10 times more voters, more absentees than we do. But I think this, the effort and all the checks and balances we still have to do. And another thing about security is we didn't talk about the machines are. We do a test vote called logic and accuracy. So the machines I have in one polling location, I can't take a ballot from another location and use it on a different set of machines. Only certain ballots would work in certain, only ballots from one polling location will work in their polling locations machines and not in others. And that's another security thing we do.
What about the idea of there's been talk about voters being purged from the voter rolls, right, for not voting. Anton, is that something that's done? If someone doesn't vote a bunch of times, do they get purged?
Yes.
How many times?
So what happens is once you're registered to vote, if you don't have any voter activity after 2 years, voter activity is defined as voting or signing a petition or requesting an absentee ballot, updating your registration. Those are things that are considered voter activity. If a voter doesn't have voter activity after 2 years, you get put into what's called a confirmation status. And that's when we send you a notice that says, hey, you haven't had any activity. Are you still living where you say you live? Or are you registered to vote here still? And if we don't hear from you after a 4-year period, then you are removed from the rolls. So this is state law. We have list maintenance activities that we do every year, every county board of election. And so we follow that. It's by directive of the Secretary of State through state law. And so we follow that explicitly. But that's sort of how that happens in terms of, people getting removed from the roll.
Brian Hester, remembering what was said earlier, where we said that mistakes don't equal fraud, can someone get purged by mistake, by accident?
I mean, yes, it can happen. But when I say that, I want to be very clear. It's very difficult because what it would take is, because everything is done in a bipartisan process. So when we are dealing with this supplemental process of purging somebody, we're always checking our data. We're always doing look backs to make sure we haven't missed a voter activity. And again, all those notices that go out, there's a member of the opposite party on the staff checking that list to make sure that they're properly there. Has it happened? Yeah, I think there have been some cases where it was shown that somebody was purged and they still lived at that address. For whatever reason, they never got the notification card, never responded to it. We don't know. The good news is all they have to do is re-register to vote. During that, and the process Antoine laid out is like a 6-year process before you're actually canceled. If at any time that person either responds to the notification card, signs a petition, or votes, that takes them out of the confirmation status, and the clock starts ticking again. The other form of this is with what we call NCOA, which is National Change of Address, where we get a notification that somebody has moved out of the state. There's a similar process with that. I think the timetable is a little shorter. But yes, mistakes can happen. They rarely do. And when they do, we correct it.
And Brian Mead, what are you seeing whenever it comes to, keeping your voter rolls? What if there's someone out there who literally only likes to vote in presidential elections, so they only vote once every 4 years, that they won't get purged because it's not within that 6-year time frame?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's basically it. We probably have about 20,000 voters in Licking County. They only vote in presidentials, and they don't really make it past the second hurdle. So they are just fine because they're voting every 4 years.
Antone, can you talk to me about provisional ballots? We hear a lot about those from time to time when there's a voting problem, when someone has an issue. They're like, oh, you can do a provisional ballot. You can do this. You can do this. What is a provisional ballot, and what's a reason someone needs one?
Sure. So a provisional ballot is we vote a voter on a provisional ballot when there's a question about their voting eligibility. And typically it has to do with either your address, there's an address issue, or there could be a name change issue. And so I'll give you an example. A voter comes to vote and they say, I live at 123 Main Street, but our poll book says you live at 456 Main Street. And so we need to vote you on a provisional ballot because we need to make sure that you actually live at 456 Main Street. And so I think the misconception about provisional ballots is that they never get checked. They get thrown in a drawer. My vote won't count. But by law, every board of election in the state of Ohio reviews each provisional ballot with a bipartisan team. So here in Franklin County, We have teams of Republicans and Democrats who review every provisional ballot. If we have 15 provisional ballots that were cast, we review every one for eligibility. And then we make a determination whether or not they're going to count. And we present that to our bipartisan board to accept or reject. And so usually the validity rate or the approval rate is somewhere 80+%. What we've seen in recent elections is some more provisional ballots being rejected because of a lack of an ID, after the ID laws changed. So we've seen a little uptick in that. But provisional voting is a process that is secure.
Of them. Now back on the record. So what's good about a provisional ballot is it allows us to investigate. And then if we investigate, hey, this person should have been able to vote. Well, good. Now we have a ballot to go with that voter and count it. Whereas if we didn't have provisional ballots, that voter would find out after the fact, yeah, you should have been able to vote. Sorry. Better luck next election. So that's what's really great about a provisional ballot is it allows the voter to cast their choices and then allows the board to investigate and confirm that that person was eligible to cast that ballot and then count it.
And Brian Mead, a couple of things that have come up when we were talking about provisional ballots here is if you don't have the right ID or it doesn't, that's a way that you can still vote that day and you can figure it out on the back end. So I guess we should say when you vote, you need to have your driver's license or a state issued ID. Is there any other ID that's accepted besides those two?
Yeah, you can have a passport if you're in the military or a dependent. You can use those military IDs. But the important thing is if you don't have an ID and you vote provisionally, you need to come and bring a valid ID to the board of elections in that cure period so we can count your ballot. So the provisional will not count if you don't show any ID and then don't present one of a valid one, like a new driver's license.
And that cure period is the Saturday after the election.
Okay.
It used to be, I think, a little longer, but now but you literally just come to the Board of Elections and we'll photocopy your valid ID, pair that to your provisional ballot, and then the board is able to approve it.
It used to be 10 days. It's now 4 days after the election. That's correct.
So if you have the unfortunate circumstances where like the day before election day, you lost your ID because you lost your wallet, you could go and vote provisionally and then maybe go to the BMV, get a new driver's license, then bring it down, right?
Yep. People do that. We've had people do that.
Yeah.
We actually have the BMV right outside our office.
Oh, you have a one-stop shop there. Okay.
We do.
I did want to circle back to it's called House Bill or Senate Bill 293, that the bill that impacted absentee ballots. It got rid of that 4-day grace period. Did that bill do anything else? Because just from my perspective of covering it on my show, we mainly talked about the 4-day grace period. Were there any other provisions that changed for you all with that bill? Or not to your knowledge?
I think the biggest one is it's looking at mismatches or mismatches in our data when it comes to the date of birth, social security number, or driver's license number. So we might have, and I'm talking handful of more voters who are going to be asked to do a provisional ballot to fix those mismatches. And there are a number of cure periods where voters can also come in if we, for some reason, have you flagged because what we have under your voter registration mismatches when we cross-reference that with other databases. There are cure periods where they can fix that, or they can vote a provisional ballot in the election and cure that. That I think is the other big component of it.
Antone, is that something that you have some people flagged in your system where there's something that doesn't make sense and you need to check on it?
Yeah, I mean, to Brian's point, we're to flag BMV mismatches. I think in Franklin County, out of nearly 900,000 voters, we have about 7,200 that have a BMV mismatch. We were required to send them a notice, which we have. And if they don't correct their BMV mismatch, I think it's 2 weeks before the election, then they'll have to vote provisionally. And that, again, it gives them an opportunity to correct the issue. But it's a very small number. I mean, 7,200 out of nearly 900,000 registered voters in Franklin County. So the issue is small.
Mhm. And to our audience who is listening in our webinar audience, if you have a question for our panel, you can put those into the Q&A. A member of the League of Women Voters is going to send some questions to me, and we'll get started on those questions soon. I can see that some have already been put in, so now would be a good time if you have one, if something's come up that we haven't covered that you have a question on, put that question into the Q&A box of the webinar. Brian Mead from Licking County, what advice do you have for the public on election day? Election day, the May primary, I don't think we expect it to be as busy as a general, but it's still an important day. What advice do you have for people when they head to the polls on election day?
Well, do your homework. Know who you're going to vote for. Know what issues you're going to vote for. Have your driver's license ready. Double check that it hasn't expired. So work that out before you come so that it is a real quick process on election. And
Brian?
the same goes for early voting, really.
Yeah, Brian Hester, if you want to add to that, what advice do you have? I guess we could say, what advice do you have prior to election day and on election day for people?
I mean, I don't think I'm going to shock the League of Women Voters by saying have a voting plan and figure out how you want to vote. Do you want to vote by mail? If so, understand what the deadlines are with that. None of this is new information, and those strategies still apply in this election. Have a voting plan and stick to the plan.
Anton, what about you? Advice for the public?
Yeah, I echo all that. I think that I say this, and sometimes people don't like me saying it, but voters have responsibilities, right? I mean, your voter registration is in your hands, and so we want you to check your registration, make sure that it's up to date. If you've moved, you need to tell us that you moved. And to Brian Hester's point, you have a plan, and Brian Mead's point, you know who you're going to vote for. And I would just say, I would always encourage voters to be patient, particularly when you go to vote on election day. You're dealing with poll workers, they're your neighbors, they're people who stepped up to say they want to help make sure people have an opportunity to vote. And there's different experience levels, and our poll workers are fantastic, and they just want to assist people and make sure that they vote. There may be a line, there may not be, but just be patient and thank your poll workers, because what they do is tough, and we appreciate what they do for us.
And Brian Mead, you mentioned have a voting plan and know what's on your ballot, know who you're going to vote for. Not telling anyone who to vote for, but just knowing what to expect, so you're not surprised when you get into that polling booth, right? Do you find that do people tend to not know what's going on in a primary more than a general, just because there's because primaries don't get as much buzz as the general election?
Yeah, I guess a little bit. I think really it's the issues they don't really know about, and that can cause a lot of time at the machine reading the language and understanding what that issue will actually do. I think your primary voter definitely knows the candidate they want, but yeah, a lot of times they forget, hey, I'm going to have a few issues on my ballot. How does it affect me? How should I vote? And that sort of deal.
Anton, what are you expecting for primary turnout this time around? There are some competitive races. It's not the most exciting of all elections, but it's also not the dullest. It's not the worst.
Yeah, I don't like to predict turnout. It's hard to predict turnout, but I'll give some perspective. In the presidential primary of 2024, Franklin County had a 16% turnout. So I think you can expect probably something of that nature for this upcoming election. I think you'll see a big turnout in November, obviously. But yeah, primaries tend to be a little lower, but still important. It's important to go out and vote. It's important to support the candidates and the issues you want to support. And we encourage everyone to do so.
Yeah. Brian Hester, what do you say to people who say to you, maybe someone comes up to you and says, "Oh, I don't vote in the primary. I don't know what's going on," or I only vote in presidential elections." How do you encourage people to vote?
I remind them that that's not the only race on the ballot, and that there are ballot issues on there. I mean, we've all seen the news, and we know that there are people that are very upset about property taxes. There are ballot issues in the primary. And if you don't want to vote in a partisan primary, you can ask for questions and issues about. I think one of the things, as somebody that's recently worked the vote center or primary, I think that a lot of voters forget what a primary is for, and so they get really. Sometimes we have to explain why we're asking what party they want to vote for, because some people don't think that's any of our business, but they don't understand that in a primary, you're voting in a party's election that we just put on. And so we need to know which ballot you want, and that's why we ask for it. Other times people are insist that we'll see in the voting record they never voted a primary, and they go, "Well, why would you ask me that? I'm a Republican. I'm a lifelong Democrat." Well, we don't know that if you've never voted in a primary. So there is that voter education component, but I think every election matters because there are local issues that are always going to affect you and your communities. These races decide what you're going to face in November. So I would encourage people to keep that in mind. The ballot you vote in November is decided by the ballot you vote in May.
Yeah. Yeah. And Anton, something that I talked about, I interviewed Jen Miller from the Ohio League of Women Voters a few days ago, and we were talking about how even if you've asked for a Republican ballot the last time or a Democratic ballot the last time, you can ask for whichever ballot you want each time you go vote. Is that correct?
That's correct. Ohio's an open primary state. So if you 2 years ago in 2024, you asked for a Republican ballot, this year you can ask for a Democrat ballot. And then you will be registered as a Democrat. And I think that's, again, the voter education that's a lot of voters don't understand. In Ohio, you can't just declare your party. You do that through the primary voting process. So a lot of voters will call our office and say, "I want to switch my affiliation to Republican or Democrat." Well, you have to do that in the primary process. And once you do that, you're going to be affiliated with that party for the next 2 years. And so again, that's an education piece for our voters.
So if you pick that ballot, you're affiliated with that party. So then the mail you get for the next 2 years will be
Correct.
influenced by that. Okay.
That's right. That's
Right.
right.
And then you could switch it 2 years later, pick a different ballot, and then get all
Yeah.
different mail for another 2 years, right?
Correct. Or if you want to be unaffiliated or independent, we call it unaffiliated in Ohio. You ask, as Brian Hester said, you ask for a questions and issues only ballot. So you come in to vote in the primary, you don't want to vote in either party, Libertarian, Republican, Democrat, you can ask for an issues only ballot and you would just vote the issues, no candidates.
Right. And Brian Mead, every county has a way to go to your website and look at your ballot ahead of time, right? So you can see what it'll look like. You don't have to be surprised when you get in there. You don't have to do like weird research. You can just go and look and see your ballot ahead of time just to give yourself an idea.
That's correct. You can get a sample ballot, look at it online through everybody's website. That's correct.
Yeah, sample ballot. That was the words I couldn't think of. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna transition to some of the questions that we have in the Q&A box, and I'm gonna try to weed through these a little bit. We did have one question come in that was wondering if any Board of Elections department is gonna make any like PSAs, TikTok videos, Facebook posts to share confirmation of security of elections. Do you I guess basically talk to me about your social media game. Are you guys are you on TikTok?
We are not on TikTok specifically. We're on every other social media channel, Instagram, all the X, all the other channels. But yeah, our social media, we will ramp that up and we'll have we'll try to have engaging content. We hope that people will share it and get the word out, get the right information out.
Brian Hester, are you on TikTok?
Well, personally, yes, but the office is really more on the Facebook, Instagram, and X, like Antoine said, and we do use it. In fact, we were, I think, social media BOE office a couple years ago for some of our voter education efforts, and that's a big component of our voter education is using social media to let people know when we have a new polling location change, explaining them the primary voting process. How do you change your party affiliation? That's always been a component of our strategy building into an election.
Brian Mead, are you planning on meeting people where they are? Getting on TikTok to answer some questions?
No TikTok, but
Mhm.
like the others, we got Facebook and Instagram, but no TikTok.
Mhm. We have another question that says the League of Women Voters has been actively registering voters. Can you talk about the process of verifying that these new registrations are eligible for voting by the Board of Elections? So how do you go about if the League of Women Voters goes out and does a registration drive, how does the registration drive translate into your computer systems? Everyone muted. I don't know.
I guess I'll take that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a process we do every day. Once we get the card, we'll enter it into our database. And then each night that is uploaded to the statewide database, and it does a check with the BMV and some other background checks, I guess. And then it's approved. So it's pretty well a day or so after we get the card, you're pretty well registered. If there is an issue, maybe a mistake on the card, we'll send a letter. If you fail to check a box saying that you're a U.S. citizen or going to be over 18, we will communicate to you.
Yeah, I think that's basically the general process, and of course, if it is good, there's still communication. Every voter registration generates some communication, either a problem letter or we inform the voter that we've processed their registration. Here's your polling location, and confirm that they're registered to vote.
As we sit here and talk now, the voter registration deadline is April 6th. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. But that means, so if you do it online, you can do it on April 5th or 6th, then you should be fine. But if you're going to do it by mail, it takes longer. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if someone is listening and is not registered to vote, which I think this is probably a very voter heavy audience, but if you're not registered to vote, you have until April 6th to register online, and you can still register for the May primary, right?
Yeah, the vast majority of registrations are received online. So
Mm-hmm.
through votoohio.gov, that's the Ohio Secretary of State website.
Mm-hmm.
And so as long as you have your state ID, driver's license or state ID, you can register or update your registration on votoohio.gov. And that's what we encourage people to do. And that's the vast majority of our registrations that we get.
We have another question that says, if you are worried that your vote by mail ballot will not get there in time by election day, can you vote on election day provisionally? Like, how would that work?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that does happen, and you will vote a provisional ballot because we will have you flagged as having requested an absentee. You will vote a provisional ballot, and then basically what happens is we confirm that we never received that absentee ballot back, and if everything else is in order on your provisional ballot, that's the ballot will count.
Mm-hmm.
We have a related question that says, how can we trust the mail to be delivered on time? Too many times the mail is not delivered within a week. So what do we do there?
Well, the post office, USPS right now is telling voters 7 days.
Mm.
You to ensure that it's going to get to your county board of elections, you want to put it in the mail by the 7th day before the election. So if you want to get to us on that Tuesday, the prior Tuesday or Wednesday of that week, you need to put it in the mail. Or if you don't want to put it in the mail, you can drive it to your local county board of election. I mean, that's really your two ways.
All right. So the procrastinators out there need to pretend that the deadline is 7 days before the election. Is that right?
Yes, and I mean, we get them faster than that? We do, but sometimes for whatever reason, it takes longer, even if it's from across town. And so the USPS is working as hard as they can. I'm sure both Brians do this, but the Secretary of State meets with USPS before each election. Here in Franklin County, we have our own local meeting with USPS where we have a plan. We have a game plan of how mail is going to be routed, when we're going to pick up mail with bipartisan teams and chain of custody. And so we have a good relationship with the USPS. They work very hard to sweep their branches to make sure that mail is getting processed, election mail, it's identified and gets processed. But they have challenges sometimes too. So it's best the earlier you can get in the mail, the better.
Brian Mead is, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I would say if you're out of state too, you need to add a few more days to that, and then also you can go on our website and sort of track your mail to see if we received it or not,
Mm-hmm.
and do not procrastinate. I mean, if you say you requested an absentee ballot and you haven't got it, well, you call us as soon as possible. We'll send a second ballot out. We'll only count one,
That's good.
but don't ask for an absentee ballot like April 7th and then wait until April 30th and say, hey, I haven't received my ballot. You should be checking the websites to make sure, hey, that we actually got your application and that we mailed the ballot.
Brian Hester, if your plans change and you requested an absentee ballot, but then, or maybe you forgot to mail it in, can you surrender it and you vote normally? Can you go to your local polling place?
No.
No.
You'll still have to vote a provisional ballot. Now, in some BOEs during the early vote period, you can bring it in and they can cancel it and let you vote a regular ballot during early voting. But that is a discretionary thing. We're not required to do that. But again, the only reason you're doing a provisional ballot, it's not a bad thing. It's just to make sure that you don't try to vote your vote by mail and vote at the early vote center or at the polls. So we're just holding your ballot in bay to confirm that you're not trying to vote twice. Once we confirm that, if again everything else is in order, your ballot's going to count. It's just going to count in the official canvass when we process the provisionals.
We do have a question that is kind of related to the SAVE Act. What is the argument for the federal government to have access to voter rolls from the states? It is only a partisan argument. Is it only a partisan argument, or is there some general agreement that it's a good thing or a bad thing? So it is a part of the SAVE Act that they want to have each state turn over their voter rolls to the federal government. That's something that Secretary of State Frank LaRose has already done voluntarily for Ohio. Does anyone know about the argument of this, why the federal government wants access to voter rolls?
I don't know why they want access. I don't know if it's good or bad, but voter information is public record. So if we start from that premise, because I know some people don't like it, that he's done this, some people do like it, but at the end of the day, these are public records. If somebody calls my office and wants Amy's voting record, I have to give it to them. If they want your voter registration, a copy of your voter registration, it's public record. I have to give it to somebody. So I don't know what the arguments are, but I do know it's public record.
Does either Brian want to weigh in there?
I won't weigh. I can't speak for an administration I'm not a part of, or a government agency I'm not a part of. So I can't say why. But as Antoine said, it's a public record. We have citizens that ask for this, and they want to check to make sure that we're following the law and that we're not letting people vote who aren't supposed to and things like that. And that goes back to the central question of how do we rebuild trust and faith in the election system, which is we have to be publicly transparent. We have to be publicly accountable. So they can take that information and they're going to find what Secretary LaRose has found, which is Ohio does a very good job of maintaining its voter rolls and making sure that only U.S. citizens in Ohio who are Ohio residents are eligible to vote in Ohio.
Brian,
That.
do you want to add in anything about this?
No, I disagree. I agree with everything Anton and Brian is saying. I mean, the base document is a public record. Why they're grabbing it, I don't know. You know, we used to work with a different group called ERIC that would help the states try to make sure their voter rolls are more accurate. So I don't know if there's a similar thing being done. So no, I probably shouldn't comment anymore. I don't know why they're asking him, but they can pretty well get it now, and it pretty well also mimics the BMV database, which I'm sure they have. So
another question that we have is, do any of you know if now that Ohioans' voter information has been shared with the administration, does that impact the likelihood that an eligible voter could mistakenly be removed from the voter rolls? So related back to that whole 6-year process that we outlined earlier, where you all have this 6-year process of purging someone, could a purge happen at the federal level and it impact the person here in Ohio?
No, because we maintain the voter registration list. It's our list. The federal government can come in and question and say, hey, we have evidence that this person's not a U.S. citizen, but there is still due process. And so that person would get a notification letter saying your voter registration is being challenged. You're at risk of being removal. If you can, prove you're at that point, if you could have documentation to support your registration, that'll register. But no, the federal government can't just cancel voters in Ohio. They don't have that authority.
Lots of questions about this whole voter rolls being given to the federal government. So given that all databases reflect, as Secretary of LaRose has said recently, a static snapshot of a moment in time of a voter list maintenance, maintenance is always in the works. It's always a work in progress. So how do Board of Elections do things like handling lags from the BMV into databases? If say you become a naturalized citizen, but there's like a lag time before you guys know that. How does that work?
Well, excuse me. Citizenship checks are done by the Ohio Secretary of State, and they're done after registrations are processed. So they run checks on citizenship, and then we get notifications from the Secretary's office as to somebody's status. So we're not connected to the federal database. Boards of elections aren't connected directly to the BMV. All that happens through the Ohio Secretary of State. So that's how we would be notified.
Someone else is asking, can you talk about what it actually looks like to check your voter registration? And are you will you see that you're confirmed right away? They're asking how many clicks are involved. So if you go to the Delaware County Board of Elections website, you want to make sure you're registered to vote properly. What are they looking for? Oh, you're still muted. There you go.
I'm still muted. If you go to our website, just go to voter search and you type in your name. That's it. And it will pull up your record. It will confirm where you're registered to vote. It will tell you your polling location, and it will show you all the available sample ballots available to you in this primary. It's that easy.
Yeah, same in Franklin.
There's another question. Okay, Brian Mead, did you want? I saw you in.
Yeah, the same in Licking. Our box is called "Am I Registered?" You click on that. It's on our homepage.
All right, pretty simple. Am I registered? Click right there. All right. There's someone else who wrote that as a poll worker, they're worried about a BMV mismatch. They're a poll worker, and they said, so the BMV mismatch, like the name, the date of birth, driver's license number shared by the BMV to the Board of Elections might not match. The example given is what if it's Bob H. Jones versus Robert Jones or something like that? What do you do?
That's not a mismatch. And we cover this in training. Natural derivatives of names are not going to do a mismatch. What a mismatch is um, really a name. It would be like the spelling of the name, not first name, but last name, or the digits are completely off on a date of birth or on a social security number or on a driver's license. Like it just literally does not match. And if they haven't had poll worker training yet, it's going to be covered in poll worker training. We'll walk them through that process. But ultimately, it works out just like any other provisional voter.
Yeah,
So
from a,
go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say the example they gave is Bob H. Jones the same as Bob Jones? So,
Yes, and the
yes.
answer is yes. I
Yes.
mean, in terms of BMV mismatches, from a poll worker perspective, all those voters are going to be flagged. So they're going to be, so if someone has a BMV mismatch and they have to vote provisionally, they're going to be flagged when you bring them up in the electronic poll book. In Franklin County, our process will be to have our voting location manager deal with that voter should we see that BMV mismatched voter on election day. I personally believe we're not going to see a lot of these voters on election day. But if we do, there's a process in place. And as Brian Hester said, we're covering that in our training on how to deal with that.
We have a question specifically for you, Antone. Can you talk about youth at the booth, or share any other programs that involve high school students getting involved in elections? Do you bring high school students in to help?
Sure, I think I'm sure the other counties do this, but we do have a program called Youth at the Booth where we any high school student who is 17 years or older, they can serve as poll workers. Here in Franklin County, we have a coordinator, a Youth at the Booth coordinator on staff, and she goes out to all the local high schools. She arranges to have training brought to the high school. So we send poll worker trainers out to the high schools. We work with local teachers. Like I tell you, in Gahanna is one of our biggest programs or schools that we have. We literally will train 40 to 50 kids in the Gahanna Lincoln High School every election, for example. But we have lots of high schools all over Franklin County. But yeah, it's a great program. It's a way for the kids to get credit in school. They get paid as a poll worker, and they get valuable working experience. So we love our Youth at the Booth students, and they really help us in terms of our poll worker recruitment. I mean, we may have anywhere from 800 to 900 students working election out of 4,500 poll workers. So that's a large chunk of our poll workers is Youth at the Booth.
Brian Mead, do you use high school students too?
Um, so a poll over that's normal. Same.
Hmm. I think you kind of broke up there a little bit, Brian Mead. Brian Hester, yeah. Do you use high school students too?
Oh yeah, we have our own Youth at the Booth program, and I got to tell you, we have found the intergenerational relationship with the regular poll workers. Absolutely love it. When we have a student in their polling location, it's really exciting for them to see the next generation coming and learning about the election process. It doesn't hurt to have a bunch of high school kids um, there on site when you're dealing with iPads and other pieces of equipment. Um, it seems to benefit everybody. It really makes it just lights everybody up. I mean, it's a great program.
We have another question that says, can you talk about ballot language? Can the explanations for the issues on the ballots be less confusing? Well, I know the answer to that is no, because none of these guys wrote it. But Brian Mead, that relates back to what you were saying earlier about educating yourself beforehand. That way you don't have to stand there and read the confusing language. You can know about it beforehand. Oh, I think Brian Mead is frozen again. All right, let's go to Antone. Can the explanations for issues on the ballot be less confusing?
I would like for them to be. We don't determine that. We don't write the language. A lot of it's by statute, and it depends on if it's a local issue versus a statewide issue. If it's a statewide issue, that's going to the state ballot board, and they're going to make determinations about what the language should be, and that gets sent down to the counties. If it's a local issue, depending on what the local issue is, there's certain language that they have to use. So it just kind of depends on what the issue is and who's in control of the issue.
Yeah,
Uh,
I wish we could. This is a case where we have no discretion.
Yeah.
It is entirely dictated by the Ohio Revised Code as passed by the General Assembly. So that ballot language, regardless of what the issue is almost always some formula or template that we are really only plugging in the numbers of the millage and stuff like that. The legislature did change how we try to explain millage in property taxes. I don't know if it made it any clearer for folks, but yes, I would love for it to be clearer. I would love to just say fire levy instead of a 12-line paragraph of all the things a fire levy could cover, but we're required to put all that stuff in there.
If a voter did their absentee ballot and then went to their polling place and voted a provisional ballot because they logged on to the system and it said their absentee ballot hadn't arrived yet, so they were worried, how do you know which vote to count and which one to discard?
Well, I guess it depends. I mean, we would, I think the other boards probably do is we would wait. So if you request an absentee ballot and we issued you an absentee ballot, then that's how you're marked in the system. You show up on election day, you're going to be forced to vote provisionally. And so what's going to happen is that provisional ballot's going to come back to the board. A bipartisan team's going to look at that ballot and then they're going to go in the system. They're going to see an absentee ballot was issued to this voter. We're going to check, did the absentee ballot come back? If it didn't come back and it's after in this case it's election day. Now it's election day. If we don't have it on election day, we never got it, then we can go ahead and count the provisional so long as everything else matches on the provisional. If we already got the absentee back, then we're going to reject the provisional. So it's really, we have systems in place internally just to check and see which one came in. If the absentee came in, we reject this one. If it didn't come in, we accept the provisional.
That's exactly right.
I'm going to do 2 more questions, and then I think we might call it a night unless someone from the league wants to jump on because I missed something. I'm trying to scroll through here while listening to everyone talk. But what are the boards of elections doing to inform senior citizens who live in together in living residences, who may make up a larger use of absentee ballots? What's being done to inform them of the new deadline of when they need to mail their ballots? And what recommendations do you have for a senior citizen kind of like living community for them to inform their residents?
So we are required by law to go out and work with the program directors of all these nursing homes. And they go out, and those that are in assisted living that can vote by mail can vote by mail. Those that are kind of what we'd call a confined voter, who may not be able to really vote by mail, we will actually go out and send bipartisan teams to allow those voters to vote in their residence. And we give them basically what is an absentee paper ballot and help them fill out a ballot so they can vote. So there are already programs in place so that these voters are covered. Those that are vote by mail, like I said, we're going to put in our printed materials reminders very, very explicitly, letting them know that these ballots need to be returned to us by election day, not the old mail deadlines. Again, educating the program directors to share this information. But we actually do a very good job of helping confined nursing home voters vote in Ohio.
And Brian Mead, I think you're not frozen anymore. Did you want to weigh in on anything that's been said in the past couple of questions?
Well, I guess with the seniors, yeah, Brian Hester is totally right. We are working with the nursing homes. I guess I've tried to say it or emphasize it. Don't procrastinate. You know, if you're a vote by mail, if you're a nursing home, you need to have your voting plan ready in place and start as early as possible. So, you know, request that absentee ballot now if you want to vote by mail. If you're in a nursing home or you you know, talk to that program director. So just don't wait till the end.
Mm.
Thank you.
And then is the last question I'll ask is, has there been any move to have more drop box locations besides just at the main county board of elections? I think that's probably out of your hands. Is that a law situation?
Yeah,
That's
the
a law
short
situation.
no. Yeah, that's set by law. We can only have one per county, and it has to be at the county board of election. So that's law.
Okay.
And there's no recent legislation to expand drop boxes.
Okay. Well, Cheryl, I think I got to all the questions unless I missed something and you popped on to tell me I missed something.
No, Amy, you did a terrific job. And thank you very much, Amy. And Antone White, Brian Mead, Brian Hester, thank you all very much. This has been very, very informative. We appreciate all four of you taking part in this. We will be putting this up on the websites of all three League of Women Voters and possibly the Ohio website as well, and on our YouTube channels. So we're going to work very hard to get all this very valuable information out there. So thank you, Amy, Antone, Brian, and Brian, and thank you to all the members of the audience. Amy, I'm going to give you a last word if you'd like it.
Hey, listen to All Sides on WOSU 89.7 NPR News. You can listen on 89.7 on the radio. We have a podcast. We're on our website, WOSU.org, you know, all the places to listen to my show. We actually did a show last week with Jen Miller from the Ohio League of Women Voters. We talked in more detail about the SAVE Act, and we had Aaron Ackerman on from the Ohio Association of Election Officials. So if you can't get enough of what we just talked about, there's even more. That show was last Thursday. So
All right. So thank you again, Amy, and thank you to all of our panelists and all of the audience. And everybody, make your voting plan and get out there and vote. All right. Thank you all so much.
thank you all.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night.